I hope that you also take with you from this presentation some techniques that you can bring back to your organizations to behave with agility as opposed to following rote agile practices. I'll be going through 7 principles that help to describe what I mean by that. And actually something else I'd be interested in, if you guys all could get your sticky notes in front of you, I would love to hear from you in terms of how you like what you're hearing. So if I'm talking about something and it resonates with you, it makes sense, note that concept down if you would. And if I'm talking about, and put it, when you leave, you can stick it up here. I expect to see these flat on the board. And if I'm talking about something and it's confusing, it doesn't make a ton of sense, I'm not explaining it well, or you're just like, no, that's dumb, that's not correct, write that down, put it on the non-resonant side, if you would. Please, I would greatly appreciate feedback from you folks. A bit, oh, maybe not. Gotta something work. All right. A bit about me. I graduated from Iowa State University in 2001. Go Clones! I moved out to California and started working with Accenture on mostly large, complex, very intensive system integration projects for the state of California. All waterfall, all massive conversions, big go lives with system implementation windows. So everything, bureaucratic space, very, very complex and large throughout that job history. Moved to Iowa, back to Iowa when Accenture sold the eligibility system that we'd built for California to the state of Iowa during the Obamacare rollouts. And that contract was written as an agile contract. So that was my first exposure to agile practices. After we got that thing live, I made the decision to quit Accenture and start my own independent practice where I continued learning about agile practices and pivoted a little bit into learning more about agile values, behaviors, which is much of what this presentation is about. In all that experience, one of the things that I found was when these bureaucratic, complex initiatives were in place, practices of agile often resulted in very bad results and sometimes even catastrophic. Much worse than the experience I had in just straight up Accenture-driven waterfall delivery methods. However, when the values of agile were applied to these situations, I saw very successful results happening. So the question I've been asking myself for many years is how do we go about bringing those behaviors to these challenging environments? And I've been doing a lot of reading, doing a lot of listening to podcasts, participating in a lot of agile discussion groups and forums, and trying to answer that question. I have put forth a hypothesis out into the ether as of a few years ago, have presented on this a couple times, but the basic premise being we need to spend more time and brain power thinking about how we break work down. We got a lot of people that are focused on leadership and culture thinking, okay, we're in this bureaucratic organization, the behaviors of agile exist in a generative organization, let's just change this to this, no problem, right? So there's a lot of agile coaches and folks that focus on that endeavor. There's also a lot of training, which I'm sure many of you have been to, around certifications, SAFe, Scrum, practices that you can apply to do agile. And the theory here is that work decomposition is an important part that sits between those two. One thing I've noticed that there is a bit of a flaw in this model, and that is that it doesn't take advantage of agility in the first place, which is needing to do this holistically and incrementally at the same time. The other problem is it doesn't really provide any much of a playbook or a checklist for people, so it's hard to follow, which brings us to the 7 principles I have to talk to you about today. Lead with vision, focus on outcomes, do less, do it sooner, do it better, do it together, and then learn and repeat back to that next do less item. I'll be going through these principles one at a time, and each one explaining a few of the concepts that I think would be possible to bring back to your organizations. Starting with lead with vision, this is one of the places where I see leaders struggle. It's common that executives will acknowledge this as their responsibility and go off into a workshop or a retreat and come up with a mission, a vision, values, principles, bring them back to the organization, post them on the website, laminate a picture that has the values and principles that they can post around the office. Does everybody have laminated posters that have, yeah, they're pretty common. The challenge that I often see is leaders that don't exhibit the behaviors that follow those, which is where that sometimes run into problems. And those are all important. Another concept I would suggest that's also important with that group is a just cause. This is something that Simon Sinek talks about. If you follow any Simon stuff, in The Infinite Game, he describes this in a lot of detail. I've pulled this just directly from that book. Must be optimistic for, not against something. Must be idealistic, bold, aspirational, and one of the more, I think, key parts of this, ultimately unachievable in our lifetimes. Must be inclusive. People outside your organization must be able to look in and see that just cause, and it must inspire them to participate. Resilient, must endure technological, cultural, political change. And service-oriented, must be for the benefit of others. And you might be thinking, well, that's something that may be tough to do unless you're in a nonprofit or a government organization. But that is something that Simon talks about quite a bit, is any company that's for profit, if they sell a product or a service that someone is interested in buying, we should be able to come up with a just cause that makes sense. I mean, unless you're a investment banker or a hedge fund manager or something. Anybody a hedge fund manager in here? No? Okay, good. Unless you're one of those evil people, you should be able to come up with a just cause for your organization. And as I was going through this, I did take a shot at coming up with a just cause for some of the projects I've worked on in the past. I've worked on a lot of entitlement program efforts. So the just cause I drafted was to create a system in which benefits are provided equitably to individuals and families in need. And here's the unachievable part, for which taxpayers are happy to pay. We know this is not something that can be achieved in our lifetime, but for people that this resonates with and for people that this motivates, it drives a behavior of wanting to improve the benefits that are provided, increase that societal benefit, make it more appealing that people would want to pay for those, as well as try to reduce costs, limit waste, reduce fraud, and get taxpayers that would be interested in actually supporting programs like that. So what can we do when it comes to Lead with Vision? You might be thinking, thanks a lot, Kevin. You're telling me what my leaders need to do. How can I make a difference in this space? And there's a couple things I have to point out here. One, everyone deserves to be led well. So if you're working for a leader that behaves inconsistently with their values, with their principles, or someone that's not projecting a vision, try to seek out leaders that do meet that criteria. Secondly, look at the work you're doing, see if you can connect it to that just cause, that vision. And if you can't, ask questions, try to figure it out with the folks that you work with, and draw those lines. And then third, you can propose your own just cause, something that might be smaller than your organizational just cause, something that's unique to your team. As an example, this is something that I've been working with Iowa Medicaid for a bit. We've got a team that's planning our Medicaid modernization effort. And we've adopted the mantra of #EpicShift. And it's basically shorthand for a desire to drastically improve people's lives through IT enablement. And through many of these principles I'm talking about today, transform how this happens at government organizations at many levels of government. So very aspirational and unachievable. But it is something that we're bringing in vendors and we're interviewing key personnel. So one story about that is we interviewed a guy that had been working 20 years at a different company. When he came to us, we looked at his resume and said, why did you jump from your current company to this other vendor that's now trying to work for the state? And he said, I saw some of the videos that you guys have posted on your website. That is awesome stuff, and I want to be a part of it. So basically, a state organization has published a vision that has caused a private organization to be able to hire someone, and that being a primary part of their criteria. So kind of an amazing thing that's happening with putting out a just cause, getting that invitational aspect to it. So that's Lead with Vision. Moving on to focusing on outcomes. This is now starting to get into that work decomposition hypothesis, and the key thing being defining your work by outcomes versus capabilities or solutions. This is also a place where I see leaders and people at all levels of organizations having trouble. They'll often, in these situations, you'll see leaders that are just in this pressure cooker. They've got requests coming from everywhere. They've got problems coming from everywhere, stakeholders that are unhappy. And these are folks that have good vision, good goals, things that they want to do, but they express those in terms of solutions and plans. And then ask the teams to deliver those solutions and plans. And so you can see what might be a problem here. Anybody think of an issue that this might cause? People don't see the vision and goals, so they can't connect to that vision and goals. They don't see the problem. And additionally, leaders often are removed from the level of work that is appropriate to create the solutions and plans. So since the teams can't see the goals, they can only see what they're being asked to do. What they're being asked to do might not actually achieve the goals in the first place. So you can get into a situation where we've done a bunch of work and it didn't create the result we wanted. So in a perfect world, your leaders are expressing what they want in terms of, they're painting that vision, they're expressing what they want in terms of outcomes and success criteria, empowering teams to create solutions and plans to deliver it. So similar situation to the vision. Thanks, Kevin. You told me things my leaders need to do differently. Really helpful. This actually has a very effective and simple way that you can mitigate when you're being given a problem to solve or being given a solution that you're being asked to deliver. Just ask for the success criteria. All right, thanks. You want me to deliver this tool. You want me to bring in this vendor. You want me to build this interface. Let's fast forward 6 months and tell me what success looks like. Let's paint a picture of the success criteria. Conversely, what would it look like if we did a bad job? What would it look like if we failed? And you can start to identify the clear outcomes and success criteria that truly will map to what is desired with the effort that you're working on. And I could honestly talk for hours of the situations in which I've been given a solution and asked some simple questions like this just to reach a point of, maybe we need a totally different solution that'll achieve these outcomes better than the one that I just asked you to do, or we've realized this isn't even an IT problem. We've got to go do something on the business side, scrap the whole thing. So you can save a lot of time and pain and energy by just getting clarity on success criteria when you're being asked for solutions to be delivered. You can also communicate in outcomes. Be a person that does that, right? This isn't just a leadership problem, it's a human problem. When we just want to solve problems as humans, and actually this is kind of interesting. There's a lot of people that put their work in the complicated, clear, simple domains. We are basically trained throughout our lives to solve problems in this space. That there's an answer, we can work through a series of steps and get to that answer. Less so in complex, where we might complete some work and it changes everything else that needs to happen, so that we need to figure out what happens next. This is a place where communicating in outcomes is much more effective. And so when people do that, it creates a situation where complex work can be done in a much more effective manner. All right, we're getting into my favorite one, which is do less. And this is where there might be some disagreement among the suggestions here. So I'm possibly some things that show up on the not resonant side of the board. I do love this quote: "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." However, if we're in a complex, emergent domain of work, things change all the time, I don't think this is quite right. And I would reframe it to instead state, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with confirming you have the correct destination. The worst possible thing you can do is travel 1,000 miles to find out that you're in the wrong place, or that you could have taken 5 steps to the side and reached the same goal that you were trying to achieve. So how do we confirm we have the right destination? We've already talked about two of those important steps. Have a vision of where that destination is, paint it clearly, focus on the outcomes, have markers on how you might need to get there, and then break the work down to something that is the smallest end-to-end possible experiment that you could run to shoot a tracer bullet towards that destination to see if you can hit it. And keep trying that until you've nailed it, and then scale up. So similarly, there's a lot of problems with coming up with really small, thin slivers of end-to-end work. I've already talked about problem number one, which is a solution-driven mindset. Do this solution, this is what I want. So let's say you've taken my advice from the outcomes principle, and you've asked for success criteria, and you've asked for outcomes. You define those. You've built your solution into a just cause. You got it all packaged up. This brings us to problem number two, which is we try to break the work down into steps and phases. And a great example of this that I've experienced in my past is with policy administration systems for insurance. I was just, I think, talking to Bob. Is that right? Working over at Grinnell. I was at Guide 1. The first step, what's the first step when you want to implement a new policy administration system, Bob? Put you on the spot. Oh, you know. Well, yes. Yes. But first, you buy GuideWire, right? or Duck Creek or some big gigantic vendor, and you bring in an army of people, and then you do an inception phase, and then you get your customization people and your integrations and your rating and your print and your conversion, and you do it in these big steps, and you complete a full solution. The challenge with that is it's easy to create that solution, good job, but not have validated any of your outcomes were getting done, or that you're furthering your just cause. And so you've done a whole lot of work over many years and got a great solution, but not something that you wanted. So how do we change this around to be something different? The key is really finding that end-to-end item, slicing that across all of your steps in a tiny, tiny little sliver, confirming you've got the success criteria met, that you're meeting the outcomes, and scaling it up. So how do we do that? So there are two reasons why I see we often do not, we have trouble breaking work down into end-to-end pieces. One of those is it's just really freaking hard to do. So we'll talk through some suggestions on how that can be done. The other one is it's just counterintuitive. And I think we're trained not to think this way, and so it takes breaking through that barrier to shift the mindset on it. So speaking to the it's hard part, I've got three possible methods that you can use, and there's likely others. Would love to hear people if they have other ideas. But I mean, you've heard minimum viable product. I think several presentations in this conference have talked about that today. Outcome hierarchy, which is the idea of setting a goal. You could start with your just cause and breaking that down in nested outcomes that all roll up to the higher level. And then scope segmentation, which is a method of just creating criteria and categorization of the different conditions you have, breaking your work down that way. And you can do all three of these at once, mix and match them together. I'm guessing that most people have seen this picture or something like this, the idea that you can build an MVP. The challenge with this is when we're in these bureaucratic organizations, or when we've been given that solution-driven mindset, you're often dealing with people that don't want you to give them a skateboard if they've asked you for a car. So this is often very challenging in environments on this side of the page. I do like the thought experiment of this, however. You know, I think back at some of those prior large waterfall jobs that I've done in the past, and I think through what could have been done in an MVP. And there's a lot of, like, I mean, I've done 5-year waterfall projects where we didn't get anything into production. Requirements design, detailed design, build, test, conversion, 5 years from start to production, where, you know, I think with an MVP, something like that could have been done much quicker. And I'm happy to talk about examples if people have time after. The outcome hierarchy, actually I'll point out this book, Sooner, Safer, Happier, as well. Like I mentioned, I've been on this search for how do we bring the behaviors of agility to some of these hostile agile environments, bureaucratic environments. This book is actually one of the best sources that I've found in my search to date that provides a lot of great ways to apply agility in agile hostile places. But one of the concepts that the author brings out in Sooner, Safer, Happier is this idea of an outcomes hierarchy. And he uses it as well to show ways to create organizational structure, which I won't get into, but an alignment to an outcomes hierarchy is often a really good way to organize your organization. Idea being you take that just cause, you break it down into strategic outcomes, you break those down into program outcomes, all the way down to execution outcomes, which can be grouped together to create a solution. They all roll up. Key rule of thumb being it must not be possible to deliver, if you deliver one of the sub-outcomes, it should always improve something above it. So if you can create a structure like that, it's a very straightforward way to break down your work once you figure it out. As an example, and I mentioned I'm working on Medicaid right now. So again, we're backing into this a little bit because we were given a solution. We've got to implement this provider management solution. But we took a look at that just cause, which breaks down into those two main strategic goals: improve services to Medicaid members and reduce costs. Well, we can improve services to members by creating a better provider network. We can create a better provider network by improving the provider experience. We can improve the provider experience by improving enrollment, re-enrollment, information maintenance. And so basically we've got those three broken down priorities as outcomes to start with our first solution. Another method of work breakdown is using scope segmentation. And I think something that's familiar to most people is using something like geography. You've got a product, you can sell it to the world if you want, but you might want to start with just the US. Maybe you don't want to deal with all the regulations of every state, so you start with the state of Iowa. Maybe you've got an urban population would be better for what you're selling, so you start with Polk County. You can drill down to city, zip code, neighborhood, all the way down to there's Kevin Sutherland's house. And you could start with just one tiny sliver of where you're going to sell that product. And actually a real life example of this just occurred to me. MetroNet is installing fiber throughout our neighborhood. They ran it to my backyard, knocked on the door, and asked me if I wanted to sign up. I was like, well, hell yes, I have both CenturyLink and what's the other one, Mediacom, and they're both terrible. So please sign me up. And I'm going to guess that they did not run fiber optics and infrastructure to the entire country before they came to my house. They were able to get experience with the sales process with me, experience with the billing, experience with idiots that run over their fiber optic lines with their lawnmower when it hasn't been buried yet. So they got to learn a lot of that information just by starting with one person and then could scale it as they go. And I mentioned the policy administration system example. I came to Guide 1 when they were in the middle of implementing a personal lines project. They had just gone live, and they were using, and this is something that typical organizations use, scope segmentation, very common. They were using all of these examples in how they had broken down the work for their first initiative. It was personal lines only, it was only auto, only the state of Missouri, 14 captive agents, very small population. And they'd been working on that for over a year and a half. And 6 months later, they came to find out that they were using a product that didn't do renewals in a way that worked, and ended up having to cancel the entire personal lines, selling off the business. So what if they could have taken that scope segmentation to a whole nother level and said, you know what, we're gonna find only people that drive a Hyundai Sonata, that have 2 kids, that have an 800 credit score, that want 500 limits, $5,000 deductible, live in this certain city zip code, and had agents that when someone came in, they could sell them that policy if that's the conditions that met, otherwise sell them in the old system. They would have learned that information after putting that, testing that certain rating situation and getting into production. They would have learned that about renewals and had either a chance to fix it or made a decision without spending $60 million to cancel the project. So it sounds bonkers crazy, right? Going down to that small level of detail. But there are lots of reasons, back to the counterintuitive point, as to why you might not want to break your scope down into something that's that granular. The reason we need to build the foundation before we build the house. We're going to lose market advantage. If we get something small out there, somebody will steal our idea. We can't scale fast enough. This will just take forever. That's too small. We got to do rework every time we do another cycle. We're touching the same code. We're touching the same stuff. Technical complexity. I'm now standing up 2 systems at one time, maintaining 2 systems at one time. I've got 2 systems where I've got data and I need to maintain it. But really the question I have is, is that better or worse than traveling 1,000 miles and getting the wrong spot? And often the answer to that question depends on how complex your situation is and a lot of the variables. So it will vary which one's better. So what can we do on this one? The suggestion, I've given quite a few options for how to break down work, but the primary idea is fight through that counterintuitiveness and try something out. It's usually fairly low risk to do. Try with something small, try to get it out there, try to get it to users, try to get feedback. All right, the rest of these are more in the execution space, so I won't be spending quite as much time on them because there is just thousands of sources of information to talk about this information. I'll mainly be tying it back to the 7 principles that I'm speaking to. Do it sooner. This is pretty intuitive in what that means, is get it to production faster, right? And obviously a strategy in which you're doing less will get you to do things sooner, much better. And the idea being you take those complete scope items and you get them into production, or you get them into the hands of a user as fast as you possibly can, and get value where you're starting to see use of what you're building, as well as learning, or maybe you only get learning. Maybe you find out that the first one's a whiff and you need to try again, but the learning is important because you don't spend a bunch of money trying to build something out. So, the primary suggestion on this one is get that do less item into production, into the hands of users as soon as possible. A couple other suggestions, less dependent on doing less. I'm sure you've heard about focusing on flow, making sure you're keeping that outcome that's defined in focus, and getting impediments out of the way, removing bottlenecks. Also, one that I don't think about enough, which is just saying no. Something that'll help you do things sooner is not having as much going on. So stop starting, start finishing. We actually just finished this book, Never Split the Difference, in the Des Moines Tech Book Club. It talks through a lot of and actually there was a presenter here that talked to about a similar concept, Scott. But one of the concepts in that book was how to say no without saying no. I think there are a lot of good lessons in there in terms of how to respond to requests you're getting, to make sure you're keeping your focus on getting something done. All right, moving on to do it better. And there were 2 whole talks today on both safety. Dustin was just right before me, or in A, and then definition of done was a session we just had. 2 primary focuses of better, and I'm not going to talk through. You could spend hours on this, but keeping people psychologically safe, Maslow's hierarchy, ensuring that there's trust and collaboration, extremely important. And then definition of done, which in the context of these principles, what we're really talking about here is definition of done of that end-to-end do less scope item. And I've put 4 criteria that I would call it as important in that definition of done. Having that outcome in focus. So, ensuring that once we've got this finished, have we evaluated, did we improve the result we wanted? And if not, what learning can we incorporate? You're not done with that first item until you've ensured that you can evaluate that. Risk. The threat today is imminent, and the security, privacy, data breaches. When we're building something or migrating something, we need to make sure that those risk and compliance items are handled. Building that in at every do less item will allow you to have that finished by the time you get done, as opposed to what we see a lot, which is like big security reviews at the end that result in a lot of churn. Quality level, I think this is an interesting one because, and we talked about this in the definition of done session, everybody has a different opinion of what done means. And what's really important is that the team and the stakeholders have the same definition of what done means. And it might be that we start with a little bit lower quality because we're just doing exploration, we're shooting tracer bullets out, we're trying to find the target. As soon as we find it and we want to scale, we amp that up and we build in a very high level of quality that's needed before we complete a scope item. So your testing gets much more important. Same with repeatability. If we're doing an approach like this, there's no option but to have the ability to continue to build similar new scope items without breaking something you've done in the past. Have that automated, have it repeatable, have it safe. So from a definition of done, or from a do it better standpoint, what can we do? We can meet people where they're at. This is something I struggle with. I'm trying to be a change agent a lot of times. And so trying to go too fast for folks is a challenge that I need to deal with. But I need to make sure I keep them safe by meeting them where they're at today. Having, confirming, and following a definition of done is absolutely critical for getting this working. Do it together, and this is where Agile really shines. It's focused on people. It's focused on collaboration. But in terms of doing it together, there's a lot of research on team structures and the most efficient ways to manage teams. In addition to things like psychological safety, their intrinsic motivators are also important. So autonomy, the ability for teams to make decisions about the work that they do, mastery, having the skills and experience to be able to do the work effectively, and purpose, being able to align that work with that just cause, with that vision. Back to the policy administration example, when you structure your teams in siloed, step-like approach, it's often challenging to meet those intrinsic motivators for the people that work on those teams. So in the context of this approach, what we're talking about here is picking out the expertise and skills that you need in terms of a cross-functional team that can deliver that first end-to-end item. And that those people are working hand in hand with users, with anyone else in the organization. I mean, do it together means truly together instead of handoffs, instead of silos. And because you've got a scope item that's small, you've broken it down into something atomic, a team of that size can handle it. Otherwise, you need an army, you need the guide wire army. And instead of bringing in the army and working across the steps, bring in the experts, show that it can be done, show that it can be done safely, show that it can be done meeting the definition of done, and scale using that same pattern with experts covering all capacities on all the different teams that can work on scope items. Another aspect of do it together is getting the right people. What I'm talking about here is not something that's for everybody. There's a level of collaboration that's needed, a level of aptitude that's needed to participate in what I'm suggesting. I've got an ad up here, which was one of my favorite recruitment ads. Ernest Shackleton in the early 1900s was looking for a crew to go on an expedition to Antarctica, and he posted, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in the event of success." And when there were actually people that responded to this, which is surprising. So you wouldn't expect it, but there are people that this resonates with. And so when they took off from England in their ship, the Endeavour, they headed down to Antarctica, and the Endeavour never did return to England. It got stuck in the Antarctic ice floe and sank. And for 20 months, the crew of the ship was either trying to get someplace in life rafts, camping out on frozen ice, often like advertised, in complete darkness and bitter cold. And I have a hard time just spending the night in my tent in my backyard, and these guys did this for 20 months. Every single one of the people that signed up for this journey made it back to England after that time, which is just insane. He had the right people for what he wanted to do on this mission. And I like to think about this, and if I were to post an ad for the work that I'm doing, which is a very challenging Medicaid modernization effort, it would read something like, collaborative agilists wanted for challenging Medicaid modernization initiative. Red tape and bureaucracy prevents value delivery at every turn. The unseen, unknown stakeholders can cancel months of hard work at any time. In the event of success, chance to improve the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and maybe change the world. So that also is probably not appealing to many people. But for the people that it is appealing to, I want them to be working with me. So what can we do on this one? Similarly to the vision and outcomes, a lot of you might be thinking, I don't actually structure my teams. I don't do the hiring. This is not something I can control. So the things that you can control are your skills, your abilities. If you're in a team that is one cog in a machine, figure out what some of the other cogs do. See if you can string together some end-to-end work that you can bring into what you accomplish in your team. And build those relationships. Make it your job to build relationships. If you have that ability to reach out and you've got work that's spanning across these multiple silos, having the ability to navigate those silos will make you much, much more effective. And involve your users. If you're truly working on something that improves their lives, they will be interested in participating in the work that you're trying to do, even if they don't have approval or whatever it is they need from a bureaucracy standpoint. All right, last one, learn and repeat. How do we learn and improve in our agile environments? You guys know this, right? What do? We have a retrospective. Does anybody have any learnings or improvement ideas that have come out of their last or most recent retrospectives they want to share? Anybody think of anything? Anybody?
Be realistic with the timeline.
Timeline realism. All right. In my experience, the most common improvement ideas are things like team improvement, process change, things like that, where you're trying to remove constraints. What we're talking about in the learn and repeat in the context of this model is really focused on those outcomes. So, and not to say that the other aspects aren't important. I mean, I think the retrospect is where we're improving our team dynamic, our morale, our interactions. Great, continue to do that. Also, focus on that outcome of each end-to-end item that you're working on. Ask the question, did this improve the outcome that we wanted? What can we do differently to make that even better? So what can we do on this one? It's tough to measure those outcomes or it's tough to have a conversation about those outcomes if you're not measuring them. So figure out a way, if you've got the list of outcomes that you're working on, to get a trend line for those. And I know that's not always possible, because we don't always have qualitative data for our outcomes, but if you can, create a trend line so that you can measure when that's getting better, when it's getting worse. And if not, figure out ways you can quantitatively assess at each scope delivery, how are we doing? And then just never stop learning. Even with this presentation, I've morphed this many times in terms of how it's structured. Actually, 2 days ago, I was talking to one of the guys that's also presenting, and he was like, what about this? And I was like, I got to add that in there. So there's always something that we can improve and we can continue learning about, no matter what. And that is the list of principles I have for being agile without doing agile. I hope this has been helpful for folks. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them now.